Welcome back. One of the most severe disease killers in the world today is malaria. Malaria is a parasite. It's transmitted by mosquitoes, and it infects people throughout the tropical world. In recent historic times, it's infected people in Europe and in the United States, but disease control efforts have kept it down. It's still a tremendously high mortality disease across the tropics. Malaria is an example of something that attacks the human organism and something that genetically we would hope to be able to have some evolutionary response to. Throughout human evolution, there have been genetic responses to malaria. For example, sometime over 1 million years ago, we actually lost the function of a gene that affects the metabolism of the blood, a part of the blood called sialic acids. That metabolism changed, giving us immunity from the kind of malaria that more commonly affects chimpanzees today. It's like we got a get-out-of-jail-free card for malaria sometime in the evolution of our genus, Homo. But 30,000 years ago or more, at least one kind of malaria evolved to defeat this defense that humans had. That kind of malaria, vivax malaria, at that time started to infect people in Africa. And after that time, humans began to get new genetic defenses. For example, today there's a blood type called the Duffy blood type. This is very much like the ABO system of blood types that many of you are familiar with, but it's a different gene, and it affects a different antigen that appears on blood cells. The Duffy has 3 alleles in very much the same way that the ABO gene has 3 different versions. But the 3 for Duffy don't cause problems with transfusions. The one that deactivates the gene, the one that makes it so that you don't make a functional version of the antigen on your blood cells, gives partial immunity to vivax malaria. And that version is today very common, up to 95% in some places, in sub-Saharan Africa. It's very rare elsewhere in the world. It's a real big genetic difference between different human populations. It's one that's there to resist this form of malaria that began to infect ancient Africans more than 30,000 years ago. The other kind of defenses that we have today against malaria, both the vivax form of malaria and the more recently evolved form of malaria, falciparum malaria, which has been infecting people for a few thousand years in Africa and throughout the tropics. Our defenses of those diseases are highly varied. The sickle cell trait, for example, a trait that if you have 2 copies of the affected gene will give you a condition in your blood that has the red blood cells shaped like sickles and is basically fatal for people who don't have advanced medical care before the age of 5. That disease in 1 copy gives a defense against falciparum malaria. It's a case of balancing selection in humans, but it's a very recently evolved genetic adaptation. It's something that has occurred in humans in Africa and also in humans in northwestern India for only the last few thousand years. Those kinds of rapid changes give us some clues that humans are pretty quickly adaptable to new environmental challenges. But there's a question that's been occupying anthropologists for years and years, and that is, what's the role of culture in moderating the environmental insults that affect us? Is disease like malaria, is that an exception to the usual pattern where humans are moderating our environments with culture? If we think about the effects of culture that we have adapting our behavior to environments, we might well imagine that natural selection, what Darwin called the hostile forces of nature, has actually really reduced in its importance in humans in the recent past. But another way of looking at things would say that, well, we're changing our environments with our culture, and that has additional unanticipated effects on our reproduction and our behavior. And maybe natural selection isn't slowing down in humans, maybe it's actually getting faster. So this lecture concerns the debate over what the role of natural selection is in our population in the recent past and today. is evolution slowing down in humans? Or is evolution continuing or even speeding up in our species? This is a part of our prehistory that I have spent a lot of time researching. My early genetic researches, looking into the patterns of recent natural selection in humans, has really led to some insights about the pace of recent evolution. And when I say recent, I really mean sometime within the past 10 to 15 to 20,000 years. In other words, the final sort of chapter in our evolution associated with the development of agriculture and the spread of humans throughout the world. So we're looking at that very thin part of our evolution at the end of this long process that we've come through to this point in the course. We've known for a long time that during the course of the last few thousand years, there have been biological changes in humans. We see those changes in the skeleton, and they were described in the last lecture. The kinds of changes in the shape and size of the skull, those are really evident when we look at skeletal samples of people from before the development of agriculture, from around the time of agriculture, and in more recent samples of people of agriculturalists. But what has become clear in the last few years is that these changes in skeletal form are accompanied by other massive changes in genetics. A very good example of this is a gene called lactase. Lactase is an enzyme that allows you to digest a sugar called lactose. And that sugar in nature really naturally occurs only in milk. So it's a sugar that if you're not a milk drinker, you don't have access to. Well, of course, every human is a milk drinker sometime in his or her life, just as all mammals are, because milk is the natural nutrition that babies get and that infant mammals get when they're born. But most people, and essentially all other kinds of mammals, lose the activity of this gene after they develop past weaning, after they stop drinking their mother's milk. And the reason is quite natural. If you're a bull, a full-grown male bull, you don't nose up under the cow for milk. It's not a food resource that you're going to have available to you. And so why make the enzyme that's only necessary to digest this particular kind of sugar? Most mammals don't do it. They turn it off. But some humans leave it on. They continue to make that enzyme as they're adults. And the humans that leave it on, we could call them mutants because they actually have new mutations that keep this enzyme active. That mutation, which has occurred 5 different times in 5 different human populations and has become common today, that mutation, it's entirely new, and it occurs only in human populations that have a long history of keeping and domesticating dairy animals. It's the environment that they've created, the environment where milk is available to them as adults, that has selected for their ability to continue to digest the milk as adults. This genetic change, it's one of the most rapid genetic changes that's happened in the human population, and it's common today in parts of the world with a history of dairying. Well, that's really interesting, but how do we learn about this kind of genetic change? When a new mutation happens, it happens on a copy of a chromosome. For lactase, that's chromosome 2, and we know the particular points on chromosome 2 where a genetic change will cause lactase to continue to be produced. When a mutation happens on a chromosome, well, there are other genetic variants that occur on the same chromosome as that new mutation. And if that mutation starts to become more common, well, it will carry with it the genetic variants that it's linked to on the same chromosome. Those things come along for the ride. They're what we call hitchhiking. And those hitchhiking variants will be relatively far away from this new mutation the younger it is. And as it persists in the population for longer, the process of recombination, when chromosomes cross over with each other, the mother and father chromosome cross over to create a new combined chromosome once in a while in reproduction. As that process goes on more and more, chromosomes are broken into smaller and smaller parts that are identical from one ancestor. So we can tell when we find a new variant that's linked to a bunch of variants along a long stretch of chromosome that are hitchhiking together, we can tell that that's new and that it's become common recently. And when we find evidence for something that's new and common, that's unusual. That means that that new common thing had some sort of advantage in the ancestral population to the people we're looking at today. That's a pattern of selection that I went studying in the genome for. As soon as we had genetic samples from many, many individuals, we could look through genomes to try to identify cases like this. And what we found was that there were many hundreds of cases where there was a part of the genome that had a new mutation that had become common within the past 10 to 20,000 years. The scope of this effect throughout the human genome is so large that when we think about hundreds of things changing in a very short period of time, that's telling us that every one of those things is something that has come from a new copy and that has involved more people reproducing who carry that copy, or more people dying who don't have that copy. And those kinds of things are found in many aspects of our biology. For example, in Africa today, there's a variant of a gene called G6PD. G6PD is a glucose phosphorodehydrogenase gene. And that gene, if it's deactivated, gives partial resistance to Falciparum malaria. The deactivated version of that gene is something that a lot of people have heard of because it gives rise to a condition called favism, where the person is allergic to fava beans. Well, favism is rare. It's most common in the Mediterranean, where fava beans are naturally grown and where some people carry this gene variant because malaria was common there in the past. But it's much more common in North Africa. And that population, which has a G6PD high-frequency deactivation, that population is one that over the past several thousand years has been subject to malaria. G6PD is one of the fastest growing of the new genetic mutations that's been subject to selection. It's grown to its present frequency in probably less than 3,000 or 4,000 years. Some other genes have been changing for longer periods of time. For example, a gene called DRD4, which is the D4 dopamine receptor, has a version that's longer, that has 7 repeats in its DNA, as opposed to 4 repeats or 2 repeats, which are the more common versions. The 7 repeat version in living people who carry it is a little bit associated with attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD. That association doesn't explain all of ADHD. It's not a Mendelian genetic disorder where you inherit it when you inherit this gene, but it is a disorder that's affected by this gene. This gene has an advantage in ancient people. We know that it's grown in frequency. A new version of it arose and it has grown, but it's grown not over the past 2,000 or 3,000 years, but instead over the past 20,000 or 30,000 years. It's an older case of natural selection in humans. There are lots of human phenotypes that we can point at that are subject to this recent pattern of selection. For example, many phenotypes that are associated with pigmentation. In Europe today, people are light-skinned, whereas in Africa, they're dark-skinned. Dark-skinned is the ancestral form for humans. We all evolved from people who had dark skin. The light-skinned version that is in Europe is something that has emerged within the past 20,000 years or so. We know that because of the many genetic variants that affect pigmentation that are new and that occur in Europe today. A variant that causes blue eyes is a gene called OCA2. And that gene is regulated by a next-door variant and a gene called HERK2. That variant is new. It's emerged within the past 10,000 years. A gene called SLC24A5 is the most largest influence on skin pigmentation in Europe. It's the one that explains most of the variation of light pigmentation, and it's also less than 20,000 years old. Today, it's at a frequency that's very high, up to 95% in Europe. It extends across much of West Asia as far as the northern part of India. That gene has emerged and has spread through that large space in the scope of a very small amount of time. There are gene variants that affect pigmentation in the eastern part of the Old World. In East Asia, there's a gene variant for a gene called MC1R. In Europe, there's a version of MC1R that makes red hair because it's a receptor that lies on the melanocytes, the genes that make pigment, the melanocytes in the skin. Melanocytes, if they receive a signal through this receptor, will transform their red pigment into darker black pigment. That transformation, however, doesn't take place if you don't get the signal. So if you change MC1R, you change the pigmentation from red to black, or vice versa, from black to red. Deactivating MC1R makes it red. And when those red pigments are transported into the hair follicles, you end up with reddish hair. In Asia, there's a version of this gene that doesn't change the hair red, but that does lighten the pigment of the skin. Those different gene variants, they've emerged over a very short period of time. And when we consider pigmentation as a system, which involves more than a dozen genes that have changed in Europe and a similar number that have changed in China, those genes are all relatively new. It's a sign of the rapid change in our population. We have some direct confirmations of this rapid change. Last time, we saw the way that European genes had changed from pre-Neolithic into early farming Neolithic populations, and then after that they changed again. Well, we have not only the mitochondrial DNA from some of these early farmers, we also have some samples of other genes. We have samples, for example, of the lactase gene. And we know that in these early farmers, people who were keeping dairy animals, who had domesticated them and were drinking milk, we see that none of them that we've found so far preserves a working copy of the lactase gene. All of them have the ancestral copy, the old copy that doesn't continue to make lactase. This population, which today in Germany has a 75% or higher frequency of the persistent form, the one that makes lactase as adults, 5,000 years ago, it had, as far as we can tell, none of it. So it's a rapid change that's unfolded in the frequency of this gene in a very short amount of time. We looked for an explanation for this kind of rapid genetic change. And the most potent explanation that we can come up with is the growth of the human population. Hunter-gatherers in the Pleistocene, more than 30,000 years ago, were living at very low population densities. And after that, the population grew. So that by the time we get to the beginning of agriculture, there are millions of people living in the world. At agriculture, the population grows even more rapidly. So that, of course, by the time we get to the Roman era, after people had been agriculturalists for as long as 8,000 years, by the time we get there, there are 100 million or 200 million people in the world. And of course, the population has continued to grow since then, so that today we're on the cusp of 7 billion people in the world. That's a massive amount of population growth. And when we think about the effects of the population on the kinds of genetic variation that we have available to us, population growth means that you have more variation to choose from, because every mutation has to occur in a person. So the more people you have, the more mutations you have to choose from. As the population grows, you get more and more of a chance of something beneficial happening. This is something that Darwin realized. He was, of course, concerned with domesticated animals, and he was an amateur breeder. And so he corresponded with people who kept large herds of animals, and he said, gee, if you keep more and more animals, you get more variations. And if you're selecting for variations, you want to keep a lot of animals to get it. And it's very much the same way when we consider humans. If we look across the human genome, the reason why today we have a lot of genetic changes that have unfolded in the recent past is because there are so many people in the recent past. And the climate and environments that we've created for ourselves have encouraged those kinds of changes. When we think of malaria, Malaria is a disease that has greatly intensified in the past few thousand years, not only because the parasite has adapted, but also because people, by farming, have made habitat for the mosquitoes. They clear forests, they keep water in open pots, they live in high-density accumulations where mosquitoes can specialize on people, and that has created a new habitat that has enabled the spread of malaria. So when we think about how human evolution has gone in the past few thousand years, we have to see that even though cultures have massively adapted us to the environment in new ways, creating new opportunities for us, they have also created new selection on us. They've given us the environment that has prompted us to evolve even more rapidly. Now, a natural question is, that's all true in the past, but what about today? Today, we live in a population where we have medical treatment that's reducing the importance of many diseases on us. We live in a population where people are living, on average, into their 70s and 80s. This is long past the age when they can reproduce. And so there's not a lot of mortality that's selecting on people today. Is it possible that today our culture has really stopped our evolution from happening? It turns out we can answer that question because we've studied the biological factors that are associated with how many children people have. This is completely a side effect of some studies that were done for the purpose of finding genes and behaviors that affect health. For example, the Framingham Heart Study is a famous study of people who lived in one town, Framingham, Massachusetts. They began following those people before 1950. And they followed those people. They took systematic measurements of things like their blood pressure and their cholesterol. They were looking for the factors that affect whether or not you'll get cardiovascular disease. But over time, as they were following those people, they began to follow the children of those people. And then, ultimately, the grandchildren of those people. So that we have a picture of the biological variation of people in one town in the United States in the last half of the 20th century. That's given rise to an enormous ability of us to look at what factors influence how many children people have in the United States in contemporary times. This is not the only study like this. There are studies like this in Wisconsin, there are studies in Britain, in Finland, there are studies in different parts of the world that ask similar questions. They're all instituted to look for the factors that explain health. But one of the things that they keep track of to explain health is how many children do you end up having? It turns out that the factors that are measured in studies like this are not unassociated with how many children people had. In fact, there's a direct association. One of the things that's very clear is that the number of children that people have is highly correlated with the age that they start having children. The younger you start having children, the more you're likely to have. And that's not saying that if you have a child when you're 18, you're necessarily going to have 4 or 5 children. It's just saying that if we lump together everybody who starts having kids when they're young, they have more kids than if you lump together all the people who start when they're later in life. It's that kind of association that is what natural selection works with in a population. Have kids younger and you have more kids, that means that if there are any genes that are associated with having kids younger, those genes will be predominant in the population in the next generation. So there's an accumulation over time. That's the effect of natural selection. Now, of course, in the contemporary human population, we're not looking at a massive shift from one generation to the next. It's not like we're looking at people born in 1950 and they have kids at age 20 and people born in the year 2000 have kids at age 15. It's not that rapid a change, but it's the measurement of change that's especially interesting. Because when we look trait after trait, there are several kinds of things that correlate with how many children these people in the industrialized world had. For example, weight. For women in the Framingham sample, Women who were heavier tended to have more offspring. And that means that, all things being equal, higher weight is being selected in the American population in the latter half of the 20th century. Height was a little bit paradoxical, because in some studies in the industrialized world, taller has more offspring. But in other studies, shorter has more offspring. So height is something that really varies, it seems, from place to place in whether or not it's influencing how many offspring you have. The heart-related traits are in some respects the most interesting. For example, if you take a measure of cholesterol, cholesterol in females is negatively associated with reproduction, so that women who have lower blood cholesterol were having more offspring. Women who had lower systolic blood pressure were having more offspring in the Framingham study. Blood glucose is something that was under stabilizing selection in the Framingham study. Having glucose levels that were intermediate were the ones that had the most offspring. Having very high or very low levels were having fewer offspring. So these factors are things that are going on in the United States population right now. Natural selection is still happening in our population, but it's happening not because people are dying young, it's happening because people are having more or less kids, depending on what kinds of traits they have. That's really interesting, because it implies something surprising about us. Natural selection is causing us to evolve as we're sitting here watching each other. It's not a rapid process. In any given generation, it's a very, very small fraction of change. But we can say that about the process of lactase evolution in the last 10,000 years. A gene that originated less than 10,000 years ago, that wasn't present at all in any measurable way 5,000 years ago in Germany, today is 75%. And all that took was a very, very small, slight increase from generation to generation over the course of the last 5,000 years. It's that small increase that over long periods of time adds up to a lot. Well, given that we're now evolving, in some respects at least, a natural question is, where are we going in the future? And this is the question with my research that everybody always wants to know. Where are we going? What are we going to look like in the future? Are we going to have giant heads? Are we going to be feeble-minded? Is it an idiocracy in the future where people are getting dumber and dumber because they don't need to be smart anymore? What are we looking at? I've got to tell you that it's always hazardous to predict where things are going in evolution, because where they're going now depends on the environment now. And of course, our environment constantly changes. If we say that in the last 50 years, low blood pressure has been an advantage in reproducing in Massachusetts, that's not to say that it's going to continue to be an advantage in the future. We need to know something about the environment in the future to make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. I think that we can make a few predictions. For one thing, we know that migration between places has rapidly increased. So people are mixing their population more than in the past. All things being equal, that would predict that in the future our population will be less diverse in terms of different places, but more diverse within each place, because we're bringing together genes from many parts of the world. We can also, I think, predict something about technology. Today, genetic testing companies are rapidly developing ways to assess the gene variants that people carry. And one of the main reasons for this is because they want to develop tests that will assess the risks that people have in conceiving children. Those are risks that are very evident in some human populations today. For example, the population of Ashkenazi Jews, people of Eastern European Jewish descent, has several genetic disorders, the most severe of them, Tay-Sachs disease, at high frequency. And that population is very interested in testing for Tay-Sachs and making sure that they minimize their risk of carrying Tay-Sachs children because it's such a severe genetic disorder. They've arranged genetic testing that can tell people Are you compatible or not in terms of Tay-Sachs? If you're not, maybe you want to consider adoption, or maybe you want to reconsider how many children you have. It's that kind of choice that genetic technology has brought into people's lives. And because that technology is increasing, we can predict in the future that evolution will come more and more under our control. Whether genes persist in the population or not will be conditioned on whether people choose to have offspring with them or not. In that sense, evolution has become something that humans have begun to domesticate. We've taken control of our reproduction in ways that our ancestors might not have envisioned. The course of our evolution over the last 6 million years that's brought us from something that is basically ape-like up to today's variation of humans, that course of evolution has followed many channels, and each channel has its own story. But all of those stories were guided by the processes in the environment, the processes of nature. Today, our story is very much more guided by the processes of human society, processes of human choice. And so, looking at our evolution from the long point of view, we really have made a transition into a different pattern of change. Nature is still there, imposing itself on us, even when we think we're living in America, where natural selection can't affect us. It's there doing it. But more and more, natural selection will become synonymous with cultural selection as we start to become more technological in the sense of genetics and evolution.